Hi there. So thanks for joining us for this week's Launchpad Music Industry Insight sessions. This week, in this session today, we're going to talk about managing your royalties. So talking a little bit about what we mean by royalties, different kinds of royalties, and the different kinds of organizations and rights holders, companies, organizations that you will need to interact with to kind of make get the most of your royalties back to you, and also how that works a little bit when you're working with other companies, so like record labels and publishers as well. So if you're kind of like just diving into this as a bit of a one-off from where we post it up later, then this is part of 5 sessions that we're doing as part of our Music Industry Insight sessions. This is the second one. We have another video that we posted online 2 weeks ago talking about getting release ready. So when you have some tracks or a track that you kind of wanting to release and put out there into the world, what are the kind of steps, what are the building blocks to approach that? And if you're watching this and you haven't kind of got a link to that, then it's up on our on the Launchpad website, on our it's on our YouTube page, and it's also up on our in our kind of opportunities blog as well to talk about advice. We've got 3 more coming over the next month or so. We've got in 2 weeks' time, we've got a session on promoting yourself and your music. 2 weeks after that, we've got about how to find funding for your music project. And then finally in August, we've got a session in that's going to look at how you get out there and play live and get live opportunities as well. And they're delivered by myself and Scott Lewis, who's our lead mentor through the Launchpad program as well. So who am I? If you've not met me before, if you've not come across me with Music Leads, I'm the kind of director and lead for music for Launchpad. I'm the director of Music Leads as an organisation, and also Come Play With Me, which is another talent development organisation based in Yorkshire. Mostly relevant for today, I think I'm also the lead. I founded the BA Music Industries Management course at Leeds Beckett University, where I teach specifically around copyright, law, IP management, and also the innovation in the music business as well. I'm also advisor for some other funding bodies as well. So I work with the PRS Foundation and help musicians and youth music on a lot of their funds. So I will look at some of their applications and help advise them and sit on panels around kind of awarding funding as well. So I'm lucky enough to have an insight with them. And also the reason I do all of these things now is my previous life as a musician. I used to run a record label. I used to manage artists. I used to run a music venue, and I used to produce records for other people as well, with all in varying degrees of success, but some was quite successful. So I've had little bits to do with various bits of the music industry. And I think, you know, ultimately the reason I do what I do now is because I'm really keen to make sure that other people can kind of see what opportunities are out there, and also can give them the knowledge and advice to kind of build careers for themselves in music. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about maximizing and managing your royalties from your music. So first of all, we're going to look at a bit like, what do we mean by royalties really, and like where do they come from, and how are they formed, like what exactly do we mean by that? And the crux of that is the second point here, which is how we think of recordings differently to compositions. And I'll break that down shortly. And then there's a few different kinds of royalties that we'll look at. You don't necessarily need to kind of log on to the names of each of them, but knowing what they do is kind of important. So we're going to look at performing royalties, which are distributed in the UK by PRS, mechanical royalties, which are distributed in the UK by MCPS, neighbouring rights royalties, which are distributed in the UK by PPL. Then, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about how what the interaction is when you're working with a record label or music distributors, and then the same talk a little bit about what music publishing is and what music publishing companies do. For those watching this live, or for those watching this back, really interesting if there's any feedback in terms of bits that we're missing, or there's a bit more depth that anyone wants to go into from what we discussed today. We're trying to make it kind of easily digestible, but kind of also aware that sometimes when you do that, you miss things. So do feel free to kind of comment on areas that we could expand in for the future, or kind of add additional notes as we go along. So managing your royalties. So music creators and music rights holders make money and generate royalties in multiple ways, depending on how and where the music is played and performed. And what we mean by that is a lot of the time we start with a music creator, but a music creator can often pass on ownership of the rights to their music. This is often a kind of very upfront thing. It's not, you will hear some sort of music industry, bad stories, but equally, a music industry is built on other people taking on the rights of musicians to make the most of it, to help them become more successful. The music creator, though, is always the first owner of a musical work. And as I've said, they will often license it to make the most of it and actually to collect the most royalties. If you are a music creator and you don't let anyone else do something with your music, it is almost impossible for you to make money out of it. So you need to work with other organizations. And that's what I'm going to break down today, really. And a musical work, as I'm calling it, is generally split into two bits, two separate copyrights, two separate bits of intellectual property. And, intellectual property is really this name we have for sort of these intangible things. It's intellectual property. It's not like a watch or a phone. And the two bits are the songs / compositions. So that's the written music, and that can exist on a page. It doesn't have to exist in a recording. It can exist as a sort of form of notation, and that is a composition. And as I say, the music creator who comes up with that is the original owner of a song or a composition. And the second is the recording. And the kind of key stakeholders in that are the people who perform it. Because, you can perform and make a recording, but not have written the song, and obviously vice versa as well. So there's slightly different sets of kind of original people involved in each of those parts. It might be the same, but it might be different people. And the rights related to each then split off a bit differently, depending on who's been involved in writing the song and who's been involved in making the recording. So yeah, when you write a song, you create the song, the composition is a piece of intellectual property, whether it's recorded or not, the actual composition. And the original writers are the original owners. At the start of it, once you're in a room and you've written a song, if I whistle a tune right now, I am the owner of that piece of original intellectual property, that composition. And so I have the rights to do with it what I want if it's an original composition, even if I just sung it right now. With recording, it's a little bit different. The people who arrange the recording, they are considered the original owners. And actually, the performers are technically viewed as being the contractors, right? So this is where the original idea behind record labels come, actually, because record labels would want to record a song and they would hire people to perform it. And so the recording company becomes the owner. Now, of course, in modern times, that's a funny concept for many of us who will make songs in our bedrooms or go and record with a friend. Or we will book a studio and go in and record. Well, if we've booked a studio and gone to record, we are the conveners. We're the people who have arranged for that recording to make place. So then we are the owners of that recording. And it almost doesn't matter if we are the performers or not, but we've paid for it, so we own it. If we're making it in our bedroom and it's completely under our own steam, and we're the people involved, then that person is the owner of the recording. The friends thing can sometimes be a bit odd. If someone has said, "Hey, come to my house and I'll record you," well, maybe they are the conveners and they technically own it. And a lot of times, if they're friends, these things can just play out and are fine. But actually, if you have recorded with friends and it's not clear who the owners are, that might be something that you want to find out. And I'll come to later what the role of the performers are, because they have their own role. And as I say, if they've been brought in, their set of rights are very particular, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we're coming at a point where most people come to this because they want to release music, so they have a recording, they have a song that a lot of artists that Launchpad work with, they've written the song, they've performed on the recording. But in the eyes of managing your royalties, there are three the three stakeholders that are important: the master rights holder, so who convened the recording, the performers on the recording, and the songwriters, the people who wrote the song, the composition that has been recorded. Now, you might be all three of those. If you're a band and it's a four-piece guitar band and you've written the songs together and you've paid to go into a studio together, you are all those three things. But there are obviously multiple scenarios where the stakeholders could differ. So, for example, if you're a singer and you've paid to go into a studio, so you own the recording, but you're recording somebody else's song, then you're not the songwriter anymore. And so the way in which the royalties are distributed for all these things are all work differently, which is what I will explain. So as well as the three stakeholders, the way the royalties flow is generally around the way in which the music is distributed. And the main three ways in which that income then gets split is when it's sold. So even thinking of streams as being a sale, I've got some examples of this coming up. Through being broadcast, so kind of being publicly put out there for people to hear around, and through duplicated, being copied, essentially. I've got some examples. I'm going to run through the examples of different ways in which traditionally music is distributed, is performed, and how the royalties flow. And then what I'll do is I'll break them down one by one. And I'll come to that. I've got that's my slide first. With all those things that I've just mentioned, there are 5 different ways to register and manage yourself. If you are all of those things and your music's getting played in all of those ways, there are 5 ways in which you need to collect all the money. The first is through recording royalties. So that's to do with sales revenues. There is the performer royalties as a performer, the performer royalties as a rights holder, which both go through PPL but are collected separately. There are the performing royalties through PRS and the mechanical royalties via MCPS. And that just looks like a slightly complicated list there if you're not aware of these things. But now I have some examples and I will break each of them down and also break down how you engage with each of those things. So the first example is the idea of a record sale and the traditional idea of it being like in a shop. So being in HMV or Jumbo, so this being like a CD or a vinyl. Now, you get paid for record sales through this, which would typically go to the distributor or a record label, and then they would pay the artist a royalty. Now, you might be in a situation with an independent record shop where you're selling, you've got a direct relationship with them, so the artist is getting paid directly. But if you've got a record label or a distributor, they are selling it to the shop and then they are giving you a royalty. And that is how the performing artists would get paid, and obviously also how the recording rights holder would get paid in that scenario. The way the songwriters get paid in this scenario is through MCPS, because if it's a physical record, there is a payment by the recording rights holder, the record label essentially, to MCPS that pays for the duplication of CDs and vinyl. Now, obviously that's not something that's overly widespread, or certainly not on a grassroots scale at the minute, but it just is something to be aware of. And as I said, that is how songwriters get paid in this situation. And again, I will break down exactly what MCPS does and so on shortly. So the most common example at the minute, which everyone will talk about, is through things like streaming, so Spotify, Apple Music, Deezer, etc. Now, the money that they pay out doesn't all go to a distributor or record label. So if you've distributed your music and it's on Spotify and you're only collecting income through your distributor, so DistroKid or Kicker or Ditto, you're actually only getting 82% of what Spotify and Apple are paying out to the rights holders. But that money goes to like the distributor or record label, and then they pay the artist a royalty after any commission as well. An independent artist might receive all of that 82%, which people on this call might be or watching this session. But it's worth noting that that's the kind of recording rights route through to the royalties. So what about its other 18%? Well, that actually goes to the publishing side, which is the songwriter, the composition side. And that's actually, and it gets even slightly more complicated because it doesn't all go to one place, it goes to two places. It goes to PRS and MCPS. So the PRS it goes to for because it's broadcast and it's performed, and the MCPS it goes to because it's been duplicated, because confusingly a stream is seen as a duplication. Again, I will break all of this down bit by bit shortly. When your music is played on radio or TV, it again goes off in numerous directions. So if it's played on, for example, BBC Radio, then they pay PRS a license fee, and then that money goes to the songwriters and the publishers. Now, I've added this little red bit here from my old slides to say that now, when it's played on radio but not listened back live, so now there's lots of really cool playback stuff you can do on the BBC Sounds app, that is seen as a duplication, not a broadcast. And so we're seeing more and more of that income paid out through MCPS. So ultimately we're seeing it's more important to sign up to MCPS as well. So that's the bit that covers the songwriters. But as the same way that the radio and TV companies pay the PRS money that goes to songwriters, they pay PPL, a fee that goes to the performers and rights holders, and that gets split half just like that through PPL as well. So you can see in all these situations, there's what feels like a very simple way of someone accessing music or music getting performed or distributed, but actually there are multiple ways in which all the money is getting distributed, because the way the industry is formed is that it considers each of these different elements separate to each other. But often, if you're an independent grassroots artist, you are all of these things. So ultimately, as with that example, you know, as we said, a number of emerging artists, grassroots artists, will own their own recorders, be the solo performer or part of a group of independent performers, and have written the songs they're releasing. You actually need to be aware of all of these processes to receive all the money that is due to you. Because if you miss out one bit, then you miss out part of the royalties that are potentially due to you. And as I said, it's kind of part of what we're trying to do, is to sort of demystify this and make it clear what you kind of need, break down what you need to do in order to kind of manage all these things. And one of the really tough things, as we'll break down, is we're going to talk a bit more in detail now, is that there is a scale to these things. So as you've heard, like, if you're not getting played on radio, for example, or having your CD sold, there are certain bits of royalties that you won't really be generating. But as soon as you do get in those opportunities, you will start to see some money coming in. So you definitely need to be aware of it. So first of all, talking about sales revenue between digital distributors and aggregators. And I think most people will be aware of this. Most people who've distributed their music for release will have worked with a distributor or an aggregator, as we call them, as we said, like Kicker or TuneCore or Ditto or CD Baby. And they will pay you the money that comes back from streaming service. One thing I really want to mention as part of this is that essentially, in terms of working with other organizations, is when you agree to have your music uploaded with them, when you have an agreement with them, you technically license them the management of your IP, your intellectual property, your copyrights. So you give them permission to make money for you and give them permission to manage your copyright. And the reason I want to mention that is because time and time again, when we're working with artists, they get confused when they upload their own music to something like YouTube and it says, you don't own this, somebody else owns this. And it's just a good opportunity to make clear that when you do get somebody else to manage your recordings, they do that. So they want to stop anyone who isn't you, well, anyone that isn't them using it on, say, YouTube, because they want to make sure that the most money is coming back to you. So they don't necessarily know that you're the artist to stop you using it. And these things are easily overcome. Most distributors have a form that you can fill in to allow you to use. But I just want to mention it because it is something that comes up a lot, that people think that they've signed the wrong thing away, but it's absolutely natural. And it is just about that company that you've given permission to make you money for your music, that they are trying to do that as well. As well as working with one of these distributors to sell your music, if you own the recording, you can also sell what we call direct to fan. So that basically means using a platform like Bandcamp or Music Glue, where you can have that direct relationship and sell it direct to people. And we mentioned this a little bit 2 weeks ago in the Getting Release Ready talk, and it's absolutely something not to overlook. And in this scenario, you don't need to, nothing else, all the money is wholly to you. So it kind of does assume that you are the rights, the rights holder, the master rights holder, the performers, and the songwriters as well. Because you're not obliged to, but it does sort of assume that you're the songwriters, or that you've paid the relevant licenses if you're selling physical records and you're not the songwriters. So there's a bit of a blind spot here if you release songs that other people have written through a direct to fan, but you haven't paid those songwriters their dues. So just to be aware of that. So talked about working specifically with digital distributors, which a lot of emerging artists will have done, and then selling directly. But what happens if you are working with a label with your royalties as well? So if you're working with a label specifically, as again, labels are really useful in terms of growing your audience and growing your revenues and making those music industry partnerships, but they will have much more formalized contracts and terms for what's happening with your music, with your intellectual property. So here, like, we'll talk about this a bit in future sessions, but some quick little questions to think about if you enter into an agreement with anyone for using your copyrights is, who actually ends up being the master rights holder? Are you transferring ownership to them? Is it time bound? Can they only use it for a certain amount of time, or is it forever? How long are you agreeing to let them manage your this recording? How long are you committed to releasing through them? Sometimes it's just for that one single. Sometimes it could be for a period of years. And then obviously, what is the percentage royalty that you would get from having your music released through them? So the other set of royalties connected to recording music is this thing called neighbouring rights, which is the thing that PPL distributes. And this is related to the people who own the master recordings and the performers on that record. And this is actually something that's a UK law. It says that performers and rights holders have the right to payment when their works are publicly performed. It's called equitable remuneration. And it's generally meant when your music is played on TV and radio. And it's quite close to, you might be aware of, the royalty that people are more commonly aware of is PRS, which is when your songs, your compositions are played on the radio and played live. Now, of course, recorded music is not played live in the same way that like artists would perform live, but the radio play kind of remains the same. And this is what goes back to the performers on the recording. One of the confusing things about neighbouring rights is they have lots of different names. So sometimes they're called performer royalties as well. I like the name neighbouring rights because it stands on its own a little bit, and performer royalties is very close to performing royalties, which is what PRS distributes. So as I mentioned before, PPL collects these royalties for songs when recordings are broadcast. And for songs that are registered on their systems, they pay out half of the income to the performers on the record and half of the income to the master rights holder. I mentioned this about recordings that are registered on their systems because not all recordings are automatically registered. You, or rather the rights holder, has to register the recording. And you have to be registered as a rights holder on PPL. And as I mentioned earlier, there are two types of membership. There's a performer one and a master rights one. And if you're both, you have to have both kinds of accounts. So if you've got a master rights account, you can register your recordings on PPL and then tag your performer account into it. The way recordings are generated is something you may have seen if you've released your own music, which is by something called ISRC codes. These are basically the codes that identify unique recordings. If you are distributing your own music and going through a distributor, when you upload it to streaming, you will get an ISRC code back from them. But if you want to generate your own, it's something that also can be done with an account within PPL as well. And so, as I mentioned before as well, once you've registered your recording with your ISRC code, performers can then claim them and attach themselves to it so they can claim the performer income. So I've talked about all this. So if you are the master rights holder and performer, you need to register both accounts. The good thing about PPL is that they are both free to sign up to. So it doesn't cost you anything, and it doesn't cost you anything to sign up to both accounts. The main barrier we find when we're helping artists is that the forms are a little bit tricky. There's a couple of questions around US tax rights. Up until recently, you did need to print them and sign them and scan them. I think they've updated that now for digital, but I think you need to still upload some form of ID. We are working on a guide to make it easier for people to understand those forms. So do get in touch with us if that's something you would find useful. But it is free and it is doable. Okay, so you can sign up to them, and you can sign up to both things, and it would be fine. What I would say is that despite describing when these royalties are triggered, as we said, it's mainly TV and radio. It is mainly national radio. It doesn't we haven't seen it pay out for local radio, so things like Radio Leeds, for example. But if you're getting national airplay on BBC Six Music, on Radio 1, 1 Extra, and certainly on TV, it can actually be quite a big chunk of, a decent chunk of money that can come through. And so if you are getting any of those plays, it is really, really important to get registered. As well as offering support for you to register yourself, we also do this through our Launchpad Plus scheme, which I mentioned last week, and I'll talk a bit about the end. Through a project we run here at Launchpad, we run a program where we help, where we register these things for artists and labels as well. So if that's something that you're struggling with, it's something that we can take on for you. And as I say, I'll talk about a bit more at the end. So if you're really struggling, you can just reach out to us and ask us to do it for you as well. Just a little note, the sort of, as I say, the sort of like lecturer in me or whatever, is that this idea of equitable remuneration, as we said, was something that is written into UK law related to when your music recordings are performed live. That doesn't count when your music is streamed on DSPs, on streaming services, which you may remember like PRS was. But it's actually being discussed by Parliament at the minute, and I think Belgium have just introduced it as a thing. So it might be something that changes in the next few years, which again would make it more important to make sure that you signed up with PPL as well. So that pretty much covers the way the royalties and rights work related to the recordings and the people who own the recordings and the performers who perform on those recordings as well. And we're now going to switch our attention to what we call publishing royalties. And publishing is the collective term for the rights that represent songwriters and composers and the compositions of the songs. So this sort of exists slightly detached from recordings. So this is about the composition of written music. First of all, we're going to talk about performing royalties. So this is what the royalties are that are collected by PRS. So, you know, we might refer to them as PRS royalties and things like that. And if you're not aware, PRS royalties are generated when songs are broadcast, which means performed live in public, so on stage at a concert, or played on TV and radio, or streamed through DSPs and streaming services. If you sign to a publishing company, it's their role to make sure this income is distributed to them and you, but it all goes through PRS at the start, pretty much, which I will break down. So, as I said, PRS income comes in lots of different ways. PRS are very helpful at providing lots of stats for this. So if you play any small gig, there will be a £10 pot that the PRS has to distribute to the songwriters involved in that gig. And that's concerts up to about 100 capacity. So if you're playing any live music event, then and you're performing your original songs, I should say, because that's the important thing, original songs, then there will be PRS due to you. If it's a larger gig and it's ticketed, and that actually larger only means 100 plus really, but it really kicks in properly around 300. Between 100 and 300, it could be either or. Then the amount of PRS that is generated is dependent on the ticketed income. And actually what happens is the promoter has to pay 4.2% of all the money earned, and that goes to pay the songwriters of the songs performed that night. So if it's a Beatles tribute band, all that money goes to the remaining Beatles who are alive. If it's your original music, then that goes back to PRS and comes back to you. That money is split, so the headliners get kind of more of the money than the support acts. If you're performing live, then you can submit when you've played live and your original material through the PRS website directly. As I mentioned earlier, this is also something your publisher would do for you as well. Your publisher would collect all that income and make sure that you were getting, if you're the songwriter and you're performing, that you're getting all the rights that were due to you. So again, one of the other common ways in which your performing royalties can stack up is by getting radio play. And unlike PPL, this does filter down. This does filter down to a really, really small local level with radio stations as well. Actually, I think the biggest paying radio station is actually Radio 2. But you can see here some of the figures for getting played on Radio 1, 1Extra, 6Music. The variations are between peak and non-peak. And again, for an emerging artist, you're probably going to be paid on off-peak, which is obviously like the evening hours and so on, which is the smaller amounts. So, for example, you can see the difference there with how much BBC Leeds gets per minute versus 6Music. And actually, if you're getting played on BBC Introducing in West Yorkshire, that's going to be quite low amount. That would be the lower end of that in case of 11p a minute. But, you know, if you're getting played a lot, that will add up. And these figures, they do change, so these might not be accurate right now, but these were taken, I think, in the last year from the PRS website, because they do kind of publish all of these things in a kind of regular report fashion as well. And as mentioned earlier, that streaming platforms also pay performing royalties when your music is streamed as well. Remember, I had that graph where most of it went off to the recording rights, but some of it went off to performing royalties. And as I say, that is half of 18%, so it's 9% of the royalties. But actually, what it means is if you're getting all the money from a distributor, then it's about another 10% that you're missing out on just through PRS. And if you remember the diagram, as I'm about to explain, there is the same amount from MCPS as well. So how do you get this money from PRS? Well, if you're not a PRS member, it is £100 to join. If you look at the PRS website, they'll give a number of examples of how much activity your compositions need to generate £100. So you can see it's sort of equivalent of 5 plays on Radio 1, 150 plays on local radio, 12 small venue plays, and just 2 or 3 larger venue plays as well. So you can actually see, while one of these things might feel like it's quite a lot, the combination of them is actually quite achievable. And again, as soon as you sign up, you're getting all of this income back to you. So moving on from the performing royalties that PRS distributes is the mechanical royalties that MCPS generates. So these are quite, on the face of it, a bit of an old-fashioned royalty, but with that said, still has an important role to play. So as I mentioned at the start, traditionally, they were how songwriters got paid when the records were pressed. And I've got an example of that in a second. So it's about the duplication of physical records. So when vinyl was pressed or CD was pressed. But it also counts as a stream, also counts as a duplication. The really interesting thing, which is quite new, we've only seen it in the last year or so, is that with the BBC having kind of rebooted their BBC Sounds app and doing a lot of shows where there is a lot of playback, this is classed as a duplication. So if you're lucky enough to get played on 6Music on Radio 1, we're actually seeing a secondary amount alongside the PRS that is coming through MCPS. So it's definitely worth, again, if you're getting airplay on the BBC channels, to make sure that you're signed up for MCPS to get those income too. So this is the example I was talking about. Traditionally, if an artist was projected to sell 100,000 records, going back 10 or 20 years, and they had to press, make 100,000 CDs, technically they needed to buy a mechanical license to be able to duplicate those records, and that money from that license all went back to the songwriters and their publishers. So, for example, if Frank Sinatra was doing a Beatles covers album, then this is how the Beatles would get paid for Frank Sinatra singing those songs. I don't know if that timeline works, but, you know, let's say it does. And it can be quite a big chunk as well, especially at that scale. And if you think about it with the sort of bigger name artists now with lots of co-writers, this is how they get bits of income. Just to note, if you are working with smaller labels who are pressing up maybe smaller run vinyl and so on, we do come across labels who ask the artist to waive the mechanical royalties, or they do a deal where instead of it going through the official channels, they would reimburse them by giving them more vinyl to sell and so on. And it can sometimes be easier for an artist to do it that way, especially if they're not all registered for MCPS. And I'm helping a couple of artists out with that at the minute, where they've had big vinyl runs and not collected all their royalties. If you're coming at this from a label point of view, do be aware that MCPS can always come back and chase you for these royalties as well. There is an official way of waiving these royalties. And there is a more, but often a lot of labels will do it in a casual way because maybe that's fine. But if labels get bigger, we have heard stories of them getting chased for the MCPS to go back to the songwriters as well. So again, as I keep mentioning, streaming DSPs, streaming platforms, they also pay out mechanical royalties when music is streamed. Exactly the same as PRS. It goes out to both of them separately, even though it goes back to the same people. So again, if you're getting all the royalties from your distributor, there is another 10% that you're not collecting from that. 10% again, and that comes from PRS as well. So if you're getting money directly from a distributor, but you're not signed up to PRS and MCPS, there is about a 20% chunk of royalties there. And you're the songwriter. There's about a 20% chunk of royalties there that you are essentially not collecting, which again is why it's important to be on top of all of these things. So I mentioned this before, but mechanical royalties don't happen when songs are broadcast on live radio, but the BBC sounds count as a playback. But also it does trigger when it's attached to a moving image on TV and film. I'm not quite sure why that's slightly different. It's to do with it being locked to the image and that being classed as a duplication. So again, if you're lucky enough to get your music on an advert or featured on a BBC programme or anything like that, then you will find you'll get PRS and MCPS if you're a composer, and PPL if you're a performer as well, and PPL twice if you're the master rights holder and the performer. So straight away, I'm spoiling the slide in a minute, so you can see how all these different royalties add up. So MCPS is also £100 to join. So it's £100 for MCPS and £100 for PRS. Here's a little bit of detail about how the MCPS license works for physical records, but that kind of is similar to what I was talking about earlier with the example. So just to be aware, really, if you are releasing an album and it's getting pressed physically, and there is another party involved, like a record label, there could be 60 to 80p per copy that is split between that would be expected to be generated through MCPS. Okay, so as I mentioned before, publishing is the collective term for managing the performing royalties and the mechanical royalties, the royalties that are there for the songwriters and composers. And if you're not aware, in the same way that record labels will manage recordings, there are publishing companies that manage the publishing, the compositions. Traditionally, if you were to sign a publishing agreement and sign to a publishing company, they would generally collect all of your performing and mechanical royalties for you. It's really their job to make sure that you're collecting everything you should do. It's like fully optimized and everyone knows what to do. It can often work well because, often many established artists and songwriters won't ever have signed up to MCPS directly until they get a publishing company involved. Although I think that should change really, especially with this royalties thing. So if you're a songwriter and you sign a publishing agreement, they will collect 100% of the mechanical royalties for you and then pay you a royalty, which I'll come back to. PRS works a little bit differently because, again, similar to equitable remuneration, it's written into UK law that the publishing royalties are split in two, to a writer's share and a publisher's share. So if you sign a publishing agreement, no one can ever stop you getting the writer's share, which is 50% of the performing royalties. It can cause a few misunderstandings, which are probably more appropriate to talk about if it ever comes up individually, when you're welcome to reach out to us. But if you sign any kind of publishing agreement and you're signed up to PRS, you will always continue to receive 50% of the performing royalties, which then that is called a writer's share. But if you're not signed up to PRS, then a publishing company, a publishing agreement can still collect all of your royalties. Now, this can be useful if you don't want to pay, or you're not able to pay the £200 to sign up to either organisation, because a publishing agreement, a publishing company can collect these things for you. Now, if you were to enter a publishing agreement, it's similar to a record agreement, recording agreement, record label contract. It's important to know certain things. How long are you signing up for them to manage your compositions? How do you get out of it? Do you still need to, is it for all of those royalties? Or is there an expectation that you still collect part of it? Do you still need to sign up to PRS as well? I would be really interested to make sure that they are definitely submitting all your live music claims, because that can be a bit a hodgepodge, and you want to make sure you're getting all of that money. And if they're collecting this for you, what is the royalty percentage for your income? So like most agreements, like a record label, will involve them collecting all your money and then paying you a percentage of it out. And so what percentage is it that they're paying out as well? There is a rise in these in publishing collection services that are kind of they are publishing agreements, but they feel like more administrative, so that they collect all your PRS and MCPS and then pay you a royalty. And part of the reason is that, again, it's becoming hard for a lot of people to pay the £100 to sign up to PRS and MCPS. And actually, some people would consider that they are more efficient to do this. You know, that's part of the model, is that these publishing companies will do this. And some of them have added benefits as well, including pitching your music for syncs, which I'll talk to in a minute, which is the act of trying to get it on TV and adverts and things like these. A lot of the more administrative deals now are quite short term, so you can always leave them whenever you want. There's no kind of commitment to stay on. So Centric is a service that offers with that, and Launchpad Plus offer it as well through its partners, which includes Centric as well. So again, if it's something that anyone is struggling with and wants to find a way to manage their royalties for performing rights and mechanical rights, make sure they're collecting everything, that is something that we have a team that within Launchpad that can do as well. So as I'll say at the end, do get in touch with us if that's something we could be helpful with. Just kind of wrapping up on a few detailed things now. So just to mention about how PRS and PPL operate. So the way they collect that money is they do a blanket license for all work performed in public, and they come together so it covers all of performers, songwriters, composers, and master rights holders as well. So that's in most places that have live music performance, so venues and certain public spaces. They also have that same license that goes out to UK broadcast channels. So all TV and radio channels also have a PRS and PPL license. And that's where the money comes from, and that's where it gets distributed back to you if you are one of those people. The final bit on publishing I was going to mention, because I mentioned it briefly, is this idea of sync. And that is the element of music publishing where producers of visual media, so anyone making TV shows, films, and computer games and adverts, they will pay a fee for the rights holders of a song to reproduce that alongside the visual image. That's a very specific thing. So they want to put the song in a TV program, for example. Now, so before I move on there, one thing to note is, with the previous blanket license that I mentioned from PRS and PPL, a film or a TV program that's just getting broadcast in the UK is actually covered by PRS and PPL. But if it's a foreign company, or it's going to get shown globally, or it's on a computer game, it needs to go through this sync license. And a sync license, it needs to be agreed between the people who own the publishing and the master rights. So that might be you, but if you've got a sync, you've probably got other people working on it with you. So you might have a publishing company or a record label. They need to agree to the same fee, this thing called a most favored nation clause, so that one side can't be disadvantaged. So it kind of needs to be the people who own the recordings and the people who own the composition rights need to get the same amount of money. So one doesn't bully the other, basically. And then that fee goes to those rights holders, but also if it's broadcast, it still generates PRS, MCPS, and PPL. And there's lots of other resources about syncing. I won't go into too much detail about it, but there are some good organizations who are pitching for it. Again, it's something we work with on Launchpad through our Launchpad Plus program. We've, I think, just landed a sync with a fee for one of our artists. So it can be something that if you have an opportunity to throw yourself out there, can be a really good opportunity as well. So I've kind of gone through most of what I wanted to do today, and I hope I've broken it down in a relatively logical and digestible way. Obviously, if you're watching this live, we are putting the video, going to put the video up to watch back, so you can kind of re-go over stuff. We'll also be putting a copy of these slides online as well, so you can kind of go through them. If you're watching this back, you can of course watch it back as many times. You already know you can watch it back as many times as you want, so you can kind of look over certain things. And as I'll say, I'll go over again in a minute, we are there to help as well as much as we can. But some tips for helping you manage your royalties is to keep a record of your repertoire. If you're writing songs, you're making recordings, make sure you know who is attached to each of those things. Who are the performers? Who are the songwriters? Are there any codes attached to them, like ISRC codes, or the code for a composition is an ISWC code? You know, have you got them all to hand and know where they are? If you're working with a third party, whether it's a distributor, a record label, or a publisher, do you know who is doing what with what songs, which recordings, and how long they have ownership over it as well? And I suppose the most important thing is I've laid out 5 ways. If you're performing and writing your own music and releasing your own music, and you're playing it live and it's getting played on the radio, as we detailed earlier, there are 5 ways that you need to be covering to make sure you're getting all the money due to you. So please make sure you're doing that. And as I keep saying, we can help with that. We can help advise you how to set yourself up, or we can set it up for you. So do be aware there's quite a lot of resources out there. And also, we've mentioned PRS and PPL. They have really great outreach teams as well. We have them at all our events. They're super approachable. Their email support is really good as well. So that's it for today, really. If there's anyone on the call today who wants any questions, I'll kind of stop the recording in a minute and we can go through them. But also don't forget, if you want to talk through any issues, just generally, we always have our drop-ins every other Tuesday. So they alternate with these sessions. So there's another one next Tuesday and then 2 weeks after that that you can book onto. But as I keep mentioning, through our Launchpad Plus program, we actively manage the royalties for about 40 artists now as well, by helping them register with PRS, MCPS, PPL, and also through recording and distribution as well. So if that's something that you feel you would benefit from or would like to work with us on, then do feel free to contact us and give me a shout too. So thanks for listening to this. I'm going to say goodbye to anyone watching us on playback and see if anyone on our live call has any questions. The next session is in 2 weeks, which is going to be around promoting yourselves, and I hope you can join us for that. Thank you very much.